before we continue, Mr. McCloskey, could I ask you to be as focused as possible? Since you have no prepared text, apparently that tends to prolong a bit what you want to tell us. That's one. We lost 50 minutes this morning. Let's try to find some extra time at the end of this session, perhaps another 10 minutes. I think due to Mr. Mladić, we had also an extended break. And that, so therefore, do you think you could finish by 2:25 if we take a 15 minutes break in between?
I'm not sure how much time that gives.
You would lose approximately 5 minutes on the whole of.
I'll try to.
Yes, I see. I should also look at Ms. Bibles, perhaps, who's also expected. Mr. Groom, you are the team leader.
It was our expectation that our submissions be 3.5 hours, and I know that we have lost a fair bit of time. We are keeping track of that. We're trying to reduce as we go, but I could not commit to using any less than the time that we thought we would.
The reason why I'm asking is the following. The defense, if we would give you, for example, tomorrow another 15 minutes, it would miss then the content of those 15 minutes. But if there's no other solution, Mr. Icj, you could address us when it comes to that. Okay, let's proceed and not lose any further time.
Thank you, Mr. President. Now, we were still going over the credibility challenge to witness RM 314, and in his testimony and statements, he talks of being in the infirmary in July. It's around the 27th, and he describes that an unknown man comes up to him and tells him that there are journalists here, something to that effect, and that he should tell them he was shot in Karakai. And the witness told the court that he told this person no, he would not do that. And then he did speak to a journalist and gave an oral statement to a journalist. And then he gave a written statement reporting this contact from this unknown people to the hospital authorities, which was then sent off to the BIH security people because they were concerned about unknown people speaking to their patients. Now, Mr. Icj, I think, confuses this issue. He says at transcript page 10880 through 10882, after questions from Judge Fluge, it transpired that in the handwritten statement he gave to the journalist and signed to confirm the truthfulness of was in fact false testimony, as conceded by RM 314. The handwritten statement was not given to a journalist, and nothing in it undercut anything he has said. And it's certainly not false testimony. What did happen during this trial, you may recall it, during the questioning, Judge Fluge did ask him questions about this, and at one point he did say that he told this unknown person that he was shot at Karakai. And then he became somewhat confused and said, now I'm confused, and his testimony stopped. So to look at this and understand it, one must look at the exhibit that Mr. Icj referred to, D281, that's the handwritten statement, but also look at P1441, which was the first page of that shows that the hospital people are sending this on to the security, and of course look carefully at the transcript. But this witness, while having suffered terrible trauma, does not undercut himself, and his statements are corroborated by all the evidence I've just discussed. Now, Mr. Icj made a brief reference that Mladić was in Belgrade on the 14th through the 16th, suggesting he wasn't involved in command. I won't go at length now, especially with the time situation we have, but I can refer you, as you remember, Mr. Butler talked about that. He basically was referring to the Mladić diaries where Mladić himself describes the business that he's doing for the VRS on both the 14th and the 15th. Mr. Butler also discussed some orders that Mladić issued on those days. And for the references, you can see Mr. Butler speaking on this at transcript 16328 to 16331, 16339 to 16340, and that's the exhibit P00363, pages 2 through 6. It's the notebook. Butler also discusses the orders I just referred to, and those orders are exhibits P2123, P2124, P2125.
Mr. McCloskey, did you say pages 2 to 6, or did you say pages 2 through 6?
It should have been 2 through 6.
Yes. Okay, then it's accurately transcribed. Please proceed.
Mr. Butler also discusses the transcript of the video that we see. It's exhibit 1147, and at the transcript pages 94 through 95, where we see Mladić speaking about what's going on in his area, speaking of Vinco, speaking of various things, including, according to Mr. Butler, the bombing that he is concerned of that's happening in Žepa. And you can see a report relating to that bombing at exhibit P2128. And Mr. Butler's overall conclusions that General Mladić is in uniform speaking about the operations and activities that are going on in his unit at the time he's at the Belgrade VMI.
Mr. McCloskey, you were referring to exhibit 1147, I think I heard.
Yes.
Yes, that's clear now. Please proceed.
Mr. Icj also made mention that there was no genocide in Srebrenica, and he claimed that our principal witness for that was Major Kingori, and that Kingori's witness collapsed. I'm not sure where Mr. Icj felt that Major Kingori was our main witness for genocide. That, of course, is not correct. Major Kingori is an excellent witness. He speaks to as you know, he was a UN military observer. He noted down the various shellings that were occurring in and around Srebrenica town. He's in Potocari and describes the horrible situation that the public and the Muslim people are going through there. He is the one that you'll remember on the video. That's the one person that stands up to Mladić and points out, he stands up and points out the men crowded in the White House, and we see him doing that. He's telling that to one of the MOOP officers on the video. And so he's very important to help us understand the suffering and the misery and the humanitarian disaster that the Serbs created, the Bosnian Serbs created in this situation. And to the degree that that fits into the genocide case, which it always does, yes, but as the principal witness of genocide, no. He also cites the 14 July mention in the Mladić diary I just mentioned before, where Mladić says he gives access to the ICRC to see the Srebrenica men, and suggests that this shows that Mladić has a big plan to exchange the people of Srebrenica. Well, you'll recall that on the 14th of July, everyone, some 800 to 1,000 men, have been summarily executed at the Kravica warehouse the day before. And the executions at Arahovac are almost over by midnight, the 14th of July. That's another 800 to 1,000 people. The executions at the Petkovci Dam started at midnight on the 15th, where another 800 to 1,000 people were summarily executed. And then on the 16th, another 800 to 1,000 people were summarily executed at the Kozluk execution site. And then on the 16th of July, some 1,000 to 1,500 people were summarily executed at the Branjevo military farm. There's no indication in this case of any desire on General Mladić's part to exchange anyone. It's his intention to kill them, as he did, as his troops did. He also noted that Mladić at the Sandici Meadow, and let me bring up, if Ms. Stewart can bring it up, it's actually P1087, page 10 in E-Court.
So you said P1087, not 0187.
It should be P1087.
Thank you.
And Mr. Icj notes that a witness at the Sandici Meadow tells us of Mladić telling these prisoners that they were going to be exchanged. That is actually RM-256. I think Mr. Icj was mistaken when he said RM-253, who was at Nova Kasaba. And looking at this to remind us where the Sandici Meadow is, General Mladić was there in the afternoon of the 13th, as you'll recall, and after he left and headed towards Konjević Polje at...
Yes. Could you please instruct your client that he should not speak aloud?
I will, Your Honor. I'm told there's no BCS translation.
There's no BCS translation. That is... could we verify that there still is no BCS translation? Mr. Mladić, is it now fixed, or is it a choice of channel? Which causes it? Let's see whether there's any BCS translation. I hear on channel 6 that there is.
I'm told now that we have the translation, Your Honors.
Yes, I had it already on channel 6. Let's proceed.
All right, Your Honors, after Mladić leaves Sandici Meadow prisoners and goes towards the prisoners assembled at Konjević Polje at about 5 p.m. from the evidence, we know that several hundred prisoners from Sandici, the people he'd just spoken to, were taken to the Kravica warehouse, and where they were summarily executed in 2 waves, one at one side of the warehouse and one at the other side. Now, I don't have time to go through that incident. It's not appropriate in this context, but that murder was part of the organized mass executions in this case. And while we do believe a Muslim came out during those executions, grabbed a gun, and shot and killed a Serb, and a Serb did grab that gun and burned his hands, It's not reasonable to believe that happened before these executions, based on the testimony of the survivors and the MOOC witnesses along the road, which we will direct you to in due course when reviewing this. As Mladić goes to Konjević Polje, you'll remember the testimony of Momir Nikolić when he says that Mladić indicates what's going to happen to the prisoners at Konjević Polje with a signal of a hand across his chest. Then he goes over to the Nova Kasaba soccer field where there's 1,000 prisoners. You should remember the survivors that was there. They killed a man right in front of Mladić. But very importantly, remember the testimony of Colonel Kasarevic, the main staff security officer for military police, who says that when he was in the area on the 17th, Major Mladić, the commander of the 65th Protection Regiment military police force, told him that he was making lists of prisoners. And then Mladić came on the 13th and told him to stop making lists. You also heard from Mladić in this case, who was confronted with that and said he couldn't really remember, it was too many years ago, but he did not deny Kasarevic's memory of the situation. Clearly, Mladić directing no lists to be taken was a sign that these men were to be murdered, and they were in the group of men that were later killed in the executions I just spoke of. Could we, almost over, Mr. Icj also mentioned General Mladić speaking to the crowd in Potocari, saying that the women and children and old men will be allowed to leave. Could we have one short video clip that I think is of utmost importance for this issue? You may recall the shot where the men are walking on one side of the bus in a line with their belongings, old men with berets. These are men that, okay, if we can play that. These are the men I'm talking about. Take a good look at them. It's P1518. You can stop that. We have a number of these men identified in our victim ID book that were killed in the mass execution. These men are separated. We don't know of any separated men that survived.
No loud speaking, no interruption when the prosecution presents its argument.
You recall on the 12th of July, Mladić announced at the Hotel Fontana that he would be screening men between 16 to 60 to determine who were war criminals among them. Critical evidence in this case is there was no screening. They took men 16 to 60, many older, some younger, as young as 8 years old. There was no significant, there was no lists taken.
It's a Is there? Could we let me check whether there's any BCS translation. Mr. Icj, I have a translation on channel 6. So I want that someone finds out what's actually going on. Otherwise, Mr. Mladić will have to put on his headphones, as we all have. Mr. Mladić, you'll be provided with headphones, and if you want to use your earphones, that's okay, but before you complain that there's no translation, you should first try your headphones, because I was informed, and I verified it myself, that there was no interruption in the BCS translation. So first, use the other phones if you have difficulties in hearing the BCS translation. I do not accept any further interruptions. Mr. McCloskey, you may proceed.
So, General Mladić at the Hotel Fontana meeting of 12th July said that they would be screening people 16 to 60. Now, you'll recall that was not on the tape that we had of that meeting, but Major Boering remembered that and testified about that. But very importantly, when those separations started that afternoon, there was no screening, there was no lists taken, the property was taken, the IDs were destroyed, as we saw in a picture on the 14th of July. They weren't given any medical, they weren't given any food, they were given just enough water to keep them alive. They lived like that at the schools around Bratunac, some for 2 nights. Clearly, by the afternoon of July 12th, the murder operation that Mladić commanded was underway. And I want to end with one bit of testimony. I want to end with one bit of testimony. If I could get the last bit of testimony, I think we would like to go into private session for, because it's of a protected witness.
Private session, please.
Leading up a session, Your Honor.
Thank you. But the transcript reads operation, it should be area, I think. Second time that the word operation is used. Chuska area.
I ask Your Honors to look carefully at the material I've mentioned and cited, and I have no doubt that we will have met our burden under 98 bis. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. McCloskey. Ms. Bibles, could you give us an indication as to how much time you'd approximately need, and also Mr. Groom to tell us whether it's he who will conclude the presentation or whether it will be Ms. Bibles?
Your Honor, it is I that will conclude the presentation, and it looks at this stage that we will need about 1 hour and 15 minutes.
1 hour and 15 minutes. Then there's they most likely will not be able to finish, but let's try to see where we end up. Now the question is whether we rather take the break now, Ms. Bibles, so that we don't have to further interrupt you. Or my colleagues advised me that we'd rather proceed. Please, Prue.
Thank you, Your Honor. And good afternoon, Your Honors and Counsel. I'll be addressing counts 1 and 2, genocide, and counts 9 and 10, terror and unlawful acts on civilians. First, I'll address the arguments made yesterday, which were limited to the neighborhood of Shirokacha. This was part of the 28 May 1992 citywide shelling described in Scheduled Incident G1. You've heard that the entire city of Sarajevo was shelled on this date, and that the G1 scheduled incident was not limited to one particular neighborhood. This attack occurred within the context of the campaign against Sarajevo as set forth in counts 9 and 10. Between May 1992 and November 1995, General Mladić and his fellow JCE members implemented a campaign of sniping and shelling on Sarajevo. The primary purpose was to spread terror among the civilian population in Sarajevo. The campaign of terror in Sarajevo was a means for members of the Bosnian Serb military and political leadership to achieve their territorial aims. The impact of this campaign was devastating for the people of Sarajevo, where the civilian population lived in a constant state of fear. Terror is a term numerous witnesses used to describe the psychological impact that this prolonged VRS campaign had on the city. General Mladić played a key role in the implementation of this campaign by commanding the SRK and its tactics of shelling and sniping activities in Sarajevo. This is evident as it pertains to G1 in an intercept, P327, dated 25 May 1992. We heard General Mladić warn a subordinate to make sure that the soldiers become aware that, quote, Sarajevo is going to shake. Sarajevo will shake. More shells will fall on per second than in the entire war so far, unquote. 3 days later, on the evening of 28 May 1992, General Mladić issued orders to indiscriminately bombard Sarajevo. Your honors have heard the recording admitted as Exhibit P105. In this recording, General Mladić instructs his subordinate to fire on the neighborhoods of the Old Town and of Mladić, because there weren't many Serbian inhabitants there. During the same conversation, General Mladić said he intended to shell the city, quote, so we drive them out of their minds, unquote. In fact, the entire city of Sarajevo was shelled on 28 May 1992 under General Mladić's orders. Several eyewitnesses testified about this incident, including RM-115, RM-147, John Wilson. RM-115 heard General Mladić on the radio ordering the shelling of Sarajevo on the night of 28 May 1995. Hours later, she was hit by a shell that fell on the state hospital in the center of Sarajevo. I refer your honors to P549, pages 71 and 72, which is the Stari Grad logbook, which confirms there were victims of shelling injured and killed in other parts of Sarajevo. Against this overwhelming evidence, the defense refers only to the origin of one shell in one neighborhood. In relation to the evidence of Fadia Tarsin, the prosecution submits that the information regarding the origin of fire is solely based on hearsay evidence of the witness's neighbors. I would refer you to the transcript of her testimony at 3424, lines 11 through 15. Reviewing the evidence more completely, UNPROFOR's Chief Military Observer, General John Wilson, testified, quote, it appeared the whole city was being engaged. Not just particular areas, but there was an emphasis of fire down in the old city, unquote. General Wilson also explained that it was a really horrendous experience for the inhabitants of Sarajevo on that particular night. General Wilson described exactly what General Mladić ordered. Shellings like this set the tone for years to come, and the evidence shows that over 3 years, the actions of General Mladić and the SRK were intentionally designed to terrorize the city's residents. The prosecution has proven counts 9 and 10. Your Honors, I'll now address counts 1 and 2, genocide. In 1992, Bosnian Muslim and Croat communities in the municipalities of Cluj, Sanski Most, Prijedor, Kotor Vlasenica, and Foča were targeted for destruction. Thousands in these communities were killed, subjected to serious bodily and mental harm, and detained in conditions of life which were calculated to destroy them. Those that survived and others were forcibly displaced. In 1995 in Srebrenica, over 7,000 Muslim men and boys were executed, while thousands more were forced from the enclave. In the municipalities and in Srebrenica, the combination of physically destructive acts and other acts targeting the foundation of the group, such as displacements, the destruction of property, cultural and religious sites, led to the physical demise of the Bosnian Muslim and Bosnian Croat communities and their inability to reconstitute themselves. Despite these well-established facts, the defense argues that genocide was not committed and that his client lacked genocidal intent. This approach ignores the facts and the accurate state of law, most recently set forth in the Appeals Chamber 98 bis judgment in the Mladić case. Let's first turn to a number of the arguments which can be dealt with quickly. First, the Icj judgment. As Your Honor, Mr. President, noted on the record at T15615, quote, I think clear to everyone that the International Court of Justice does not express itself on the individual criminal responsibility of persons, but of states, unquote. The ICJ reached its determination based on different evidence and applying a different legal standard. It is simply not relevant to your determination here at the 98 bis proceeding. Likewise, the point regarding previous ICTY cases ignores that the genocide counts for the municipalities have been upheld at the 98 bis stage in all prior cases, whether by the trial chamber or the appeals chamber following an appeal. Mladić was acquitted at the trial level, but the defense yesterday failed to recognize that the appeals chamber held that the trial chamber erred in doing so and found that the evidence presented supported a finding of genocidal intent. In terms of the defense urging a review of societal context, this is a misconception of the legal requirements. This is the notion that to prove genocide, we must be able to look objectively at a particular scenario on the ground and affix the label genocide in isolation from an accused. This is contrary to the legal requirements of the crime of genocide. As to the intent of physical perpetrators, it is not necessary for JCE liability to show that physical perpetrators were acting with genocidal intent, rather that their acts are attributable to Mladić through the JCE and that Mladić and other JCE members were acting with genocidal intent. I refer you to the Brjanin Appeals Judgment, paragraph 410, and also the Krajnik Appeals Judgment, paragraph 226. Finally, the defense argument for a numerical threshold ignores the legal requirements. It is not necessary to prove that the underlying acts of genocide, in fact, have an impact on the existence of a group. And there is no numerical threshold of victims necessary to establish genocide. It also ignores the fact that for the municipality evidence, there are two other major categories of acts of genocide beside killings. For Srebrenica, there is one other act of genocide aside from killings. These aren't really arguments. Rather, these are attempts to distract from the voices and images of genocide which have been proven in your presence. The Appeals Chamber judgment on the Mladić 98 bis genocide charge confirms that at the 98 bis stage, the analysis is quite simple. First, that there is evidence that acts of genocide were committed and attributable to Mladić. Second, there is evidence that Mladić had genocidal intent with respect to these acts. To further explain, I will first briefly set out the acts of genocide that characterize both genocides in the municipalities and in Srebrenica, and then discuss the mens rea of the JCE members, particularly Mladić and Karadzic. Turning to the 1992 genocide, consider the detailed evidence presented earlier by Mr. Traldi as the backdrop for the discussion of acts of genocide. Looking specifically at acts of genocide, first, thousands of targeted people were murdered in the 6 municipalities. Community leaders were often singled out for particularly sadistic violence and were often beaten to death or killed outright. As Icj Mladić testified, the Serbs removed those people who represented security for these communities. And that's at transcript page 2050, starting at line 21, and it goes to page 2051 at line 14. Second, serious bodily and mental harm lingers today and indelibly imprints those who survive the brutality. Look at Ivo Atlia's evidence. He survived the murders at Briševo and spoke bravely here about the murder of his own father and of his neighbors, many of whom he had to bury himself. But he would not name the women in his village who had been sexually assaulted because they were so traumatized it was difficult to stop them from killing themselves. And that's at transcript page 2315. In this vein, consider the testimony of RM70 at transcript 17652, lines 12 to 15. Quote, "My opinion was that they wanted to destroy, kill, destroy our spirit as much as they could, because a raped woman, there's no cure for a woman who was raped. I will not recover," unquote. And third, members of the VRS and other Bosnian Serb forces created conditions of life calculated to destroy thousands more targeted people in the detention camps. You've heard repeatedly that the camps, designed mostly for civilians, were not fit for human habitation. You can look to RM8, who described over 500 detainees crammed into room 3 at Karaterm, and RM88, who pointed out the hangar in which, in P526, in which 600 detainees were jammed. Witness after witness, and camp after camp, describe beatings, torture, sexual violence, and the lack of basic sanitation, deprivation of food, water, and medical care. Consistent with Icj Mladić's evidence, Your Honors heard that specific prisoners were particularly targeted for abuse and violence. For instance, an Omarska guard told Karim Mešanović that he had been put on the, quote, cooling list, to be killed, because he was in the first category of prisoners. Mešanović explained that this was meant for leaders, intellectuals, and wealthier people. That was at P3414, paragraphs 40 to 42. By the end of 1992, targeted civilians had effectively been driven out of the Serb lands or were forced into enclaves. As a result, the enclaves were bursting with Muslim detainees. By 1995, over 30,000 Muslims were inside the Srebrenica enclave. The existence of the enclaves within Bosnian Serb territories was a point of frustration to Mladić. After initial plans in March of 1995, the attack on Srebrenica began on 6 July 1995, and by the time it was over, more than 7,000 Bosnian Muslim men and boys were dead, and over 30,000 women and children had been forced out of the enclave.
Ms. Bibles, could I seek one clarification? Yes. You talked about bursting with Muslim detainees. Did you intend to say that being in the enclave would create a situation of imprisonment? Or?
Your Honor, I misspoke. What I meant to say was that the enclaves were bursting with Bosnian Muslims.
Thank you. Please proceed.
The discriminatory, systematic violence levied across Bosnia in 1992 was applied in Srebrenica in 1995. This violence assured that the objective of the overarching JCE, the destruction of Muslim and Croat communities in Serb-claimed Bosnia, was achieved in Srebrenica as it had been in the targeted areas through Bosnia. The defense claims the prosecution has not presented sufficient evidence of their client's genocidal intent to pass the 98 bis stage. This is a revisionist view of the trial record. Both direct and indirect evidence provide a sufficient basis for a reasonable chamber to conclude that the accused and other JCE members intended to physically destroy the groups. The direct evidence of the accused statements alone, taken at its highest, is sufficient to show that the accused had genocidal intent. Mladić's intent was set forth clearly in a number of documents, interviews, and intercepts. Ratko Mladić stated his intent with respect to Bosnian Muslims in 1994 at the 37th Assembly Session. He spoke of an objective that the Karadzic Appeals Chamber has considered an indication of genocidal intent. Quote, he said, quote, "My concern is not that they will create the state. My concern is to have them vanish completely," unquote. P3076 at page 49. Mladić repeatedly made similar comments about Bosnian Muslim and Croat communities in the holdout enclaves. At the most basic and pervasive level, Mladić brought and endorsed a lexicon of derogatory terms and eliminationist rhetoric when referring to the targeted peoples in Bosnia. This sanctioned verbal abuse was widespread, extending into official VRS directives. You can look at P1963. His use of the terms Ustasha and Turks was directed at enemy forces, but also civilians. See at P1969. It is well established that the use of verbal abuse relating to targeted ethnic groups is a relevant factor in finding genocidal intent. Ratko Mladić's use of these terms reverberated throughout the carnage which his forces imposed on Bosnian Muslim and Croat communities.
Ms. Bibles, I'm about at the point where I'd like to take a short break. If you'd say better after a few sentences, then I'll wait. Otherwise, we'll take the break now.
Let's go ahead and take a break.
Yes, then we take the break. We take the break a little bit shorter than usual. We resume at 1:45, the last break being 5 minutes longer than usual.
All rise. Veuillez vous lever.